thanks to the organizers of this workshop, especially Jyoti Hosagrahar, for inviting me to make this presentation. I am, of course, deeply honored to be here to speak to you, but also a little bit at a loss to think about what to say, since I'm neither a specialist of Africa nor really a specialist of heritage, though as a historian I've had to think about heritage a fair amount, and also about the distinction between the two. Two events, actually two experiences, guided me in thinking about what to say. One was the very tragic event of the fires on Table Mountain on Friday, which destroyed the library and part of the campus of the UCT. Those fires reminded me actually of fires in Australia, in my university town, Canberra, in 2003. That led me to think about climate change, global warming, the Anthropocene, and all of those problems. And the book that has just been published in the US, actually, Edward, I think it's coming out in Britain soon. This book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, to think about the age we're in, which I'm now calling a planetary age rather than just simply a global age. And I'll talk about that a little bit. And if that was the tragic experience that's guided my thoughts, and my sympathies and thoughts and sense of solidarity are completely there with my UCT colleagues. And the other one was the happy experience, and has been the happy experience of listening to Ashil, reading him for long many years, and also listening to him this morning. I had to get up really early at 3 in the morning to listen to him, and then I went back to bed, got up, a bit of sleep, and now I'm back here. You'll also have to forgive the informality of my presentation. I'll try to keep within the time limit given to me, which is 30 minutes. I'm starting my timer now, and it'll tell me if I'm going over. What interested me in your concept note and actually allowed me to find a point of connection between my interests and yours is the word sustainability, because sustainability is one of the key issues in the world today. People are actually asking whether the civilization, the industrial technological civilization that was built on the basis of European empires, colonization, and eventually, and capitalism, of course, and eventually the American domination of the second half of the 20th century, whether that civilization needs to become even more technological to sustain itself, whether this is a civilization that actually gambles on technology, or whether, given the unsustainability for most human beings of this civilization, we may want to look at other civilizations. We may want to look at other forms of life, both past and present, to see if there are at least principles of sustainability that one can inherit as a global citizen. So any discussion of sustainable heritage in any part of the world is no longer a local, parochial conversation. Clearly, if most World Heritage sites are to be found in Europe today, it means that Europeans and European civilization acted on the assumption that European achievements, only European achievements, or mostly European achievements, were worth preserving. But those achievements, while they have contributed to humanity in many ways, have also produced a civilization, and not just European, I mean the industrial technological civilization, has also produced a civilization which now has brought back the question of sustainability in a very important way. And therefore, I think we need to talk about other civilizations. There was a time not very far away even in the middle of the 20th century, when about 80% of the world's population was ruled by one European power or another. Starting in the 15th century, European expansion and the spread of European thought created what Heidegger used to call the Europeanization of the world. By Europeanization of the world, following from Heidegger, I mean two kinds of functions that Europeans did. One, I think of as a world-making function that was both destructive and constructive, and a globe-making function. The globe-making function really was this question of how the Europeans brought this sphere together, brought it together by technology, starting from deep sea-going vessels, the building of them that the Dutch pioneered and the British became very good at, to 19th century inventions like the telegraph, then the telephone, electricity, that technology coming on to today's smartphone and connections, that brings us all together. And the geologist called Peter Haff has raised a very interesting problem, saying, isn't human life now dependent on technology? I mean, have we not made this planet into a ship where, just as when you're on a ship on the sea or even an airplane, your life depends on technology. And he has produced some calculations to show that if we did not have all the technological connections that connected us, from travel, from electronic connections, everything, if you suddenly pulled out the technological connection from this world, by his calculation, human populations would crash to 11 million. So he therefore argues that technology has become the precondition for biology, for the sustenance of human life. So that's what produces this argument that we need more technology to keep this world going, or should we be looking somewhere else? And the fires, the extreme weather events, the pandemic, they have all indicated, or they all point to now a planetary environmental crisis that now looks like is the price for the extension of the human domain, somewhat mindlessly on this planet. Anthony Fauci, who was in charge of the pandemic in the US during Trump's time, he and his colleague David Morens wrote an article last September, in a biological journal, arguing that we have entered an era of pandemics where the possibility of pandemics repeating themselves, that possibility has become a strong probability, so that we may actually suffer pandemics or potential pandemics with an increasing frequency. In the last 20 years, they argue that 75% of the new infectious diseases have come from wild animals. So they're called zoonotic diseases. And as you know, wild animals don't seek us out. It's because we destroy forests and their habitat that we force them to come close to us so that viruses and bacteria can jump species. Similarly, the fires, which have to do with many man-made things, including excessive heat, unseasonally heat, hot weather in places. Australia suffered hugely in 1920. These are not unconnected phenomena on the planet today. So if you go back and think about the last 500 years, 600 years from the European expansion to today, then you see on the one hand, there was this technological globe-making function, which has really become a force of its own. And on the other hand, there was the world-making function, where the Europeans redesigned the world. They, many of us come from colonized peoples, but we didn't get colonized in the same way. There are parts of the world where the Europeans wanted some people's land, and they displaced them, and they're mostly the indigenous people, because that's where settler colonial kind of colonialism happened, and happened in Africa too, but different parts of Africa, but also Australia, New Zealand, North America, of course, and so there's those places. Then there were places where European wanted your land and labor, and that also Africa has undergone, as other people have too. Then there are places like India, where they wanted mainly to rule and skim off the revenue of the place and produced a middle class in the process that kind of loved and hate Europe, and I'm a descendant of that kind of a class. And then in some places they wanted your bodies and made and enslaved you to get mastery over your bodies. Alongside these destructive things, Europe at the same time underwent the so-called scientific revolution, enlightenment, fight against superstition, which happened in every country where Europeans went, and we colonized people responded to them differently, produced hybrid solutions, produced the kind of mimicry that my friend Homi Bhabha writes about, the hybridity that Achille was talking about this morning. But in the 1950s and 60s, as decolonization was happening, you'll remember that throughout the world, there were anti-colonial modernizing leaders in Asia, in Africa. And I always remember Aimé Césaire's book on the colonial discourse, where he ends perhaps the first or the second chapter by saying that colonialism was a broken promise. Europeans promised us more industries, more hospitals, more factories, more schools, but they didn't give them. It's now our turn to actually build them, to actually keep the promise the Europeans made, but actually broke. Out of that modernization drive, and of course, spurred on in the second half of the 20th century by the Cold War with Soviet Union and the Americans tom-tomming different kinds of modernization theories. The last 70 years have seen an enormous growth in human population, human activity, and in a kind of expansion of human demands on the biosphere, on the planet, which has produced some of the problems we are faced today. So that the question of what is sustainable, does human past in different countries give us resources from different contexts, global resources? That is why any discussion about heritage is now, I think, a global discussion, and we all start to learn from it. Just to give you a sense of the state of the world since the end of the Second World War, I want to show you some graphs, very quick graphs. People who work on climate change know these as the Great Acceleration graphs, and I take this from a piece by Will Steffen, an Earth system scientist, and this was published in 2015. They keep updating them, but I should tell you, just to give some sense of what happened, why 20th century was so distinct in human history. See, Homo sapiens, our species, is about 300,000 years old. And it took us almost 300,000 years to get to the number 1 billion. So in 1900, we were about 1.6 billion. And in 100 years, at the end of that century, at 2000, we were 6 billion. And now, into this new century, about 20 years have gone, we are close to 8. So you can see that in the last 120 years, humans have flourished in a way that they never flourished before. But the problem was that in all that flourishing, we took the planet for granted. And while we expanded all our activities, the planet reacted to the expansion of our activities. And I think that is the general setting within which I want to talk about the question of heritage. But just to give you a quick glimpse of these graphs, I'll show you some slides. Can we have the next slide, please? So these are called the Great Acceleration graphs. Uh, this these are a couple of slides in orange, and this is really, it shows what humans have been doing. So population, so the vertical line, the dotted vertical line marks 1950. And actually, if they could put in a line for 1970, you would actually see that the graphs become even steeper, 1970 on. So there's a population, real GDP, foreign direct investment, urban population, primary energy use, fertilizer consumption, large dams, water use, paper production. This is also the era of reconstruction of the world after the war. A lot of this initially coming from OECD countries, but also the decolonized countries pushing on with their modernization programs. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, this one just breaks it down into OECD countries, BRICS, and then others. So you can see that if you could imagine that line of 1970 on or 1990 on, you will see that the contribution from BRICS go up. So that's urban population, large dams, paper production. And so these two these two sets of graphs are about human activities, expansion of human activities, including population. And can we go on to the next slide, please? And the blue graphs really are about how the planet reacts to what we do. So if you look at the emission of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, the three prominent greenhouse gases, the depletion of stratospheric ozone that is going up, surface temperature, ocean acidification, which actually has an impact on marine life and eventually on biodiversity, shrimp agriculture, the nitrogen to coastal zone, tropical forest loss, domesticated land, and that's where the forests are being lost, terrestrial biosphere degradation. So that's how the planet has reacted. That's kind of just showing some graphs showing you the factors behind the planetary environmental crisis. And can we go on to the next slide, please? So some Earth system science, including scientists, including Will Steffen, have come out with this kind of visual aid showing, they're calling them planetary boundaries. And so they've got different factors there: genetic diversity, land change, land system change, phosphorus, nitrogen. And the green is where we are meant to be. Yellow is the zone of uncertainty. The red is definitely beyond the zone of uncertainty. It's a high risk. So, okay, thank you very much for showing the slides. You can take them off. Yeah, thank you. So that is the context. That is the planetary context, or the global context, if you want to call it so. So then the question is, what do we do? How do we think about history and heritage in this context, if this is a global context? When Europeans made the claim that they were civilizing others, they made that question into a question about universalism and particulars. And they also made the claim that their civilization represented the universal values, while the natives were all embroiled in their parochial local values. Their civilization, because their civilization was based on an extolling rationality, on elevating the place of reason in life, science and technology, while native worlds were full of superstition and non-rational practices. They are very funny. When Ashil was talking about the hybrid things we produce out of this European claim, it reminded me of a story about Jomo Kenyatta in Facing Mount Kenya. His autobiography, he tells it's a very interesting book because he tells the story of having been once a participant in his grandfather's practice as a magician, and he, because he'd also trained in anthropology, he tries to justify it by saying, look, don't dismiss magic. there might be ways in which magical thoughts telepathically transmit themselves and produce vibrations in other people's bodies and create certain effects. But he had also asked his old teacher, Malinowski, Malinowski, the famous anthropologist, to write an introduction for this book. And if you read Malinowski's introduction, you'll see in what trouble Malinowski was in trying to endorse this book. And the only way he can endorse Kenyatta's statements on magic was by saying, look, we can't blame Kenyatta when Europeans themselves practice a lot of occultism. So why can't we allow him to do that? But it's those sorts of tensions and hybridization that the profoundly part of this experience of colonization. And the idea of the universal was, I would say, was profoundly a part of European ideology itself, because something you realize going to the history of colonization is that while there are universals about human beings, I mean, who can deny that we all belong to the species Homo sapiens? Who can deny that we're all connected to each other in that large-scale evolutionary history? But it's also clear that the universal cannot be mobilized only for political ends that we think of as good. Universals are often mobilized for political ends, for ends of power that you wouldn't approve of. And that's what Sartre wrote when he wrote his preface to Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, where he said, and it's a point that would go back to Hegel, I guess, where he said, look, it is only because one human recognizes the humanness of another human that he can make a slave out of the second person. The fact that we make slaves out of human beings, not animals. Animals can give us obedience, but only a slave gives us the recognition that a master wants from a slave. It means that for all that is common between us as humans, that universal substance cannot actually stop slavery, or in my Indian context, cannot stop the kind of humiliation that Dalits, the so-called the ex-untouchables of India, have had to undergo in the hands of upper castes throughout the entire history. And that is why I think one of the problems I was working with in writing Provincializing Europe, I was trying to say that, look, one might think of the universal as a form. Like when you look at the human being, you see a human form, but you need two human beings to actually see that the form belongs to this category called human. But it's an abstraction. And when an empirical entity like Britain or like France comes to you and says, I embody the universal, I am the universal, what they're doing is actually usurping the place of the universal, which can only be a form and not a substance in that sense. So when you make the universal into a substance, like our shared genetic history, our shared evolutionary history, then that substance can be mobilized to make wars, to create slavery, to create the humiliation, to inflict humiliation and oppression on Dalits, on women. It's humans who oppress other humans because they recognize the other person's humanity. It can also produce forms of welcome. Every history of colonization in which you find the European facing the native, even when they don't share a language, they recognize each other as human because the European would only ask the native, not another animal, to find out where water was available or where shelter might be available. So the fact that we recognize each other as human is not enough to prevent the oppressions we also create. And this is where I think the question of heritage becomes important. And I go back to something I've learned from Achille, and I want to develop it a little bit. In a very interesting essay on proximity in Achille's recent book in English called Out of the Dark Night, Achille discusses this question of universalism and points out that the universalism, I mean, he discusses particularly French universalism, that universalism has to be distinguished from cosmopolitanism. often universalism is non-cosmopolitan, because one person comes and says, I am universal, and you are not. And you have to be like me in order to be universal. So universalism, the ideology of universalism, can come to you as an oppressive ideology of assimilation. And of course, assimilation produces resistance in other forms, as we saw in the negritude movement, as we see throughout the colonial world. Assimilation, and as we see in contemporary French debates about Islamo leftism and all of those things, and a universalism that says I am the universal is actually parochial, because it's never cosmopolitan. So Achille opposes to such parochial universalism an idea of in common, having something in common, having something that is actually cosmopolitan, even if it's not universal, in the sense that it doesn't happen everywhere. So what is that? What does that mean? I mean, for me, first of all, it means that in today's world, when we think about heritage, and we think about world heritage, preserving something for the interest of all humanity, where all of us are subject to the danger of fires and pandemics, and when all of us are thinking about the question of what is sustainable, in that context, the question of non-Western heritage, the question of what the histories of indigenous peoples may have to teach us in terms of new ways of thinking about the relation between nature and culture. This is something that has been emphasized for some time now in the writings of Bruno Latour, Philippe Descola, Viveiros de Castro from Brazil, and others in Australia who are looking at indigenous society to see what principles of sustenance. I mean, discovering the principles is not discovering solution, because you discover principles from past societies where populations were smaller, problems were of a different kind. So there's still the question of how you scale them up for 9 billion, 10 billion people. But finding these principles is very important in past practices. And I completely agree with what Achille was saying, and some of you have repeated since, that heritage is not just about the built environment. Heritage is about practices. Heritage is about intangibles. But the question is, do we find in these practices and intangible some principles from which we can learn? We don't have to copy these principles. And that's why it seems to me that Achille's notion of in common, what is in common, what is cosmopolitan, has to be an expansive, aspirational category. In other words, your heritage has to be of a kind, in order for that to be considered world heritage, that it can speak to other people's aspirations. Another way of putting it might be to say that just as there was a time when many people adopted European manners because Europeans were living an expansive conception of themselves. Similarly, can we think of our own heritages on this expansive principle? It doesn't mean an imperializing principle, because it means a cosmopolitan principle in which can we organize our heritage in such a way that other people have something to learn from it. To close off this question, and I'd be happy to discuss this more if there's question answer time. One experience I had of such an attempt at preserving local heritage, but which immediately spoke to my sense of the cosmopolitan, was the experience I had when I visited District 6 Museum in South Africa, a long time ago, soon after apartheid was gone, and I was there. And the historian Siraj Rasool from the University of Western Cape wanted to give me a surprise, and he said, let's go on a drive. And I went on a drive with him. And there was a strip of a metalled road in the middle of nowhere, so just empty ground on the two sides. And Siraj suddenly stopped the car in the middle of this road and said to me, Dipesh, get off. And I got off, puzzled that I didn't know where we had come. And then he stood on the road and pointing to the road, he said, do you see the road? I said, yeah, of course, we are standing on it, but it's not going anywhere. And Siraj said, I grew up on this road. And I said, what do you mean? Then he told me the story of District 6 and the plan to completely empty that town and pull it down. He told me the entire story, and then he took me to District 6 Museum. And I was not only overwhelmed by what I saw as an ongoing creative human attempt to memorialize both past joys, sorrows, as well as human cruelties. But I was also overcome with the desire to see such museums come up in my own country, in India. So I went back and I've written about District 6 museums in different places and of that experience, because I can think of many other displaced communities. I mean, climate change will produce displaced communities. Climate change will produce probably, currently the number of world refugees is 65 million or something officially. We may be dealing with hundreds of millions of displaced population if the seas rise further. So the question of heritage preservation, the question of preserving their memories, to be able to tell the story of the devastation that this civilization has wrought, we will need ways of being together, ways of being cosmopolitan in such a way that we desire to be in each other's place, that I take something from your life and you take something from mine, while being appreciative of the differences. I mean, I have not, my ancestors did not experience the kind of colonialism that many working class people did in India or elsewhere in Africa, or that the enslaved people did. So I've gotten to the end of the time I gave myself, but I'll just finish off by saying these things. That a colleague of mine, Pierre Charbonnier, in France, has written a very interesting book on freedom, liberty, and abundance. And he develops a distinction, which some of my colleagues in America have also done, of a distinction that actually is characteristic of the well-to-do countries, countries that did well under imperialism and that still do well. And the distinction is the distinction between the land you live on and the land you live from. So if you look at people in the US, people in the US don't just eat things that are grown only on the US soil. We consume things that are grown everywhere in the world. So that's why people say that if you have to sustain people at this level of consumption, the human population, then you will run out of land. You will need 3 or 4 other planets. And there's a very interesting Hoover Institute report on the current consuming classes, and I'll mention that. And then there was 2000, the numbers for year 2000 showed that 70% of the consuming classes came from the usual suspects, the US, the North America, the Japan, the industrialized part of Western Europe, the affluent countries in 2000. Now 70% of them come from China, India, some parts of Africa, and other developing places. So the question in front of us is the civilization that Europeans built, and on the shoulders of which we've built globalization, Chinese modernization, Indian modernization, is that sustainable for everybody? Or do we need to turn to other principles, other examples, and we only can find them in the past or in the present, but elsewhere, somewhere else? And there's an American scholar, Roy Scranton, who's written a book called Learning to Die in the Anthropocene. And his argument is that the current crisis is such that this industrial technological civilization probably will not survive. And we should resort to philosophy so that we learn how to let this civilization die. Now, that's not everybody's position. There are many people who say there should be geoengineering, we should do this and that, and humanity should be in charge of the planet. The problem with that proposition is what the pandemic shows, that we are a minority form of life on the planet. The majority forms of life by weight and numbers are microbial. It's viruses and bacteria, not even insects. And it's very hard for us to know how to manage that world of bacteria and viruses. I mean, the pandemic shows how helpless sometimes we are when they get the better of us. In the 1980s, 90s, there was a dream. I mean, that a colleague of mine who worked on justice once wrote a sentence saying, where nature was once, there will be human justice. What kind of human justice can prevail over viruses? So I think this whole question of heritage and history and sustainability, these questions have to be looked at in the context in which we are, which is almost a planetary context. And therefore, no serious discussion of world heritage in any part of the world can be carried out without looking to the state the world is in, the state of which the tragic fires on Friday were only a symptom. Thank you very, very much.